I'm now pleased to be up here to introduce our next speaker, who's a return speaker to the KV Summit, Dan Gardner, who is a best-selling author, who's going to talk to us about forecasting and improving forecasting and how to be both optimistic but have healthy self-doubt about one's own forecasts and the opinions of experts. And the most recent thing I've been trying to figure out is Vinod asked me to do this introduction, and what was the subliminal message there? But we'll see. With that, Dan, come on up and you can inform us. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. It's 2 o'clock. Your circadian rhythm has you kind of down. You're a little bit tired right now. You're probably hoping I'm going to keep it light and entertaining. Nothing too heavy or controversial, I hear you. So I'm going to talk about Israeli politics. And specifically the death of Yasser Arafat, because that's not light and entertaining enough. I promise this will be light and entertaining, but I am going to start with the death of Yasser Arafat. You'll remember Yasser Arafat, of course. He was the longtime head of the PLO, longtime enemy of Israel. In 2004, Yasser Arafat was the head of the Palestinian Authority. He fell ill and was rushed to a hospital in France where he promptly died. Immediately, there were rumors and allegations that Yasser Arafat had been poisoned by Israel. But this is the Middle East. There are always rumors and allegations, so that didn't mean too much. However, a few years later, some scientists tested some of the personal effects of Yasser Arafat for the presence of radioactive polonium. Polonium, everybody know polonium? Right, that's what did in Alexander Litvinenko, allegedly by the Russian government, allegedly I emphasize. And they found polonium on his personal effects, including his toothbrush. Okay, the plot thickens. Well, 2012, they test Yasser Arafat's remains. 2 separate teams, a French team and a Swiss team, go and test Yasser Arafat's remains for the presence of polonium. And that raises an interesting question. What happens next? What happens? Are they going to find polonium? Well, at the same time that this is unfolding, this little suspense novel, at the same time that this is happening, one of the largest research programs on forecasting ever undertaken is underway. And that research program uses real-world forecasting questions, and so they created a forecasting question based on this story. And this was the question they asked. Will either the French or Swiss inquiries find elevated levels of polonium in the remains of Yasser Arafat's body? Now, you're a forecaster, you're in this research program. How do you answer this question? You very quickly realize this isn't about big data and algorithms and arcane math, right? You're just going to have to do it the old-fashioned way. You're going to have to look at whatever information is available, and you're going to have to think about it and make a subjective judgment. And this is the type of forecasting question which I want to emphasize we all encounter every day, even here in the land of tech. You are making forecasts that are the basis for your very important decisions, and you're making those forecasts using subjective judgment. So, how are you going to answer this question? Well, there's different ways of going about it. One I call the ideologue method. It's very simple. Anytime a human being encounters a question, particularly when it's a question that has certain inbuilt emotional resonance, like this, you'll have a quick, intuitive response. That's the answer. To certain folks who have strong convictions, that's good enough. You know the answer. Did Israel poison Yasser Arafat? A certain variety of ideologue will say, of course they poisoned Yasser Arafat! And then they'll give you an hour-long harangue about all the sins of Israel. And then there's a different variety of ideologue that will say, did Israel poison Yasser Arafat? That's ridiculous. Why are you even talking about this? And give you an hour-long harangue about all the ways in which Israel has been wronged. Now, is that a good way of making a forecast? No, it's terrible, of course. You know that. Everybody knows that. Every rational person knows that. You have to step back, gather information, and actually think about it. Which brings me to method number 2, the TV pundit method. You can probably see where I'm going with this. TV pundits, give them credit, know a lot. So if you have a question like this, they know a lot about Israeli politics, right? They know a lot about Yasser Arafat and Ariel Sharon and the Intifada and Mossad. They know a lot about all these things. And if they need more information, they'll go and they'll gather that information. And you ask them this question, they will stroke their chins and look sagely and think for a moment about various things, and out will come an answer. Is that a good method? Well, at this point, I wish I had a video clip of TV pundits talking about the question, did Israel poison Yasser Arafat? I do not. However, I have a video clip which is entirely typical of the species at work. It's from 2008, it's the McLaughlin Group. John McCain has just won the Republican nomination for the presidency, and he's about to announce his vice presidential pick. Okay, and we all know what the answer is, Sarah Palin. Okay, how did the TV pundits do?
False prediction. Whom will McCain pick as his running mate?
Mitt Romney.
Minnesota Governor Tim Pawlenty.
Charlie Crist, Florida Governor.
Condoleezza Rice.
Buchanan and Wright, it will be Mitt Romney. Happy Mother's Day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. I love John McLaughlin, I really do. This is a really terrible method of making a forecast. Vaguely pondering information is not a good way of making forecasts. Now, this is not a terribly scientific demonstration. However, the best research ever done on expert forecasting was done by my co-author on the book Superforecasting, a very eminent psychologist named Philip Tetlock. And he came to the conclusion that, guess what? The average expert was really, really bad. Okay, so this is not a good method. But you might be thinking, wait a second, maybe what about the most prominent experts? What about the most famous experts? Surely there must be some sort of advancement based on accuracy. In fact, in Phil Tetlock's data, he found an inverse correlation between fame and accuracy. Think about that. It's pretty amazing. Think about that. Let that sink in. So the TV pundit method is a terrible way of making accurate forecasts, but it is an excellent method of making entertaining forecasts. And so I'm just going to give you one more. It has nothing whatsoever to do with this talk, but I have to show it to you because it's great. It's 2013. It's Chris Matthews telling us who will win the Republican nomination for the presidency in 2016.
I predict the hard right is going to take over the Republican Party in 2016, and the nomination is going to Rand Paul. You watch. This is what I do for a living.
It's just a killer punchline. Although, to be fair, it could still happen. It's my Donald Trump hand gestures. Okay. So the TV pundit method doesn't work. What does work? Of course, I'm coming to method number 3, which is I grandiosely call super forecasting. And to explain what I mean by super forecasting, I need to back up. And believe it or not, I need to back up all the way to where I'm talking about the U.S. intelligence community. Now, when I say the intelligence community, people say, do you mean the CIA? I say, yes, the CIA, but there are also all these other agencies. In fact, there are 16 intelligence agencies, all of which report to the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Collectively, the U.S. intelligence community has an annual budget in excess of $50 billion. A huge proportion of that money is spent on forecasting. That forecasting is extraordinarily important. It informs the decisions in the White House. How good is that forecasting? Lots of people have lots of opinions, but that's all they are. The true answer to that question is we don't know. They aren't tested for accuracy. Isn't that amazing? Decades and billions of dollars not tested for accuracy. To the enormous credit of officials in the ODNI, they said, that's probably not good. We should do better, right? How do we learn how good we are, and how do we get better? And those officials went to my co-author, Philip Tetlock, and they had conversations with him and with others, and they decided to fund a forecasting tournament. Now, when I say forecasting tournament, it kind of sounds like a game. It's not a game. It's a research program, an enormous research program. What they ended up doing was going to 5 different university-based research teams and said to these teams, you use whatever method you want to use, and we will ask you the questions that we, the intelligence analysts, have to ask all the time. Big, tough, important questions. Will Russia seize the Crimea? Will Greece default? What's going to happen to the Chinese economy in the 4th quarter? Right? Big, important, difficult questions. And then we're going to ask those questions of you, and we're going to ask hundreds of those questions, and we're going to do it over 4 years. And at the end of this, we'll be able to compare all the data. We'll be able to see which methods work. We'll be able to learn. We'll be able to get better. Very sensible thing. You might ask yourself, why didn't you do it decades ago? But that's another matter. But they did it. and to their enormous credit, they did it. Well, guess what happens? One of the research teams is led by, as I said, my co-author, Philip Tetlock. That team was called the Good Judgment Project, and the Good Judgment Project cleaned up. Won by a country mile. There were all sorts of, even the Good Judgment Project itself was an enormous research program with all sorts of variations, all sorts of interesting findings, but I'm just going to focus on one finding in particular. The finding was that there were certain individuals, a small percentage, between 1% and 2%, of all the people who were involved, who were outstanding forecasters. And how many people were involved, by the way? A lot. At any one time, there would be between 2,800 and 3,000 volunteers making forecasts for the Good Judgment Project alone. Over the course of 4 years, 20,000 people were involved. Okay? And out of them, they discovered this very small stratum of outstanding forecasters. And they were consistently outstanding. I emphasize consistently. Why? Because anybody can get lucky once, but when you keep doing it over and over again, hundreds of times, over 4 years, you're probably looking more at skill than luck, right? So what makes super forecasters so darn good? Oh, by the way, I forgot this one. Just to give you an idea of how good they are, they blew past the performance benchmarks that were set by the ODNI at the beginning of this experiment, and all the researchers thought, these benchmarks, they're way too ambitious. They blew past them. And even more impressively, they beat the intelligence analysts themselves, the intelligence analysts who had access to classified information. These were volunteers. These were ordinary folks who, when they made their forecasts, would sit down and do what we all do, go to Google. That's all the information they had available to them. And they were beating the people who had access to the information produced by the $50 billion annual budget. Pretty impressive stuff. So why are they so good? Well, here's some some things we can say that didn't matter first. You might be thinking it's all arcane math, right? Nope, not arcane math. These people are very numerate, very comfortable with numbers. But if they're using math at all, it's basic arithmetic. It's nothing particularly arcane. In fact, there was one super forecaster who's a Cornell math professor, brilliant young guy, and he actually, at the start of this research program, he said, you know, if I do well on this, everybody's going to say it's just because I used math. And so he made it a point of principle that he would use no math. No special knowledge. I want to emphasize, these are ordinary people. These are ordinary volunteers. You got a dentist, you got a pharmacist, you got a whole lot of retirees, because retirees have time on their hands. But they're ordinary people. They don't have specialist knowledge. They are informed. They're smart people. They follow the news. They follow international news. They wouldn't have volunteered to do this if they weren't that sort of person. But they're not specialists. And this is a big one. You want to say, what about intelligence? Well, they are very smart people. They do score very high on IQ tests, but not off the charts, not genius level, not at a level that ordinary mortals can't aspire to. And the way we put it in the book is basically, if you have the interest and the ability to read this book, you're probably somewhere close. Okay, so what do they have? General characteristics, intellectual curiosity, in spades. They like to learn things, right? And as a result, they know at least a little bit about lots, constantly learning. Active open-mindedness. This is a term from psychology. Open-mindedness is obvious, right? I want to hear about other people's perspectives. I want to see different ways of looking at the problem. But what's the active part? Do you know the phrase, this is about open-mindedness? Don't be so open-minded that your brain falls out. That's the active part. When you're doing all this checking of other perspectives, you're critically examining it. You're saying, is this logical? Is it supported by evidence? Does it make sense? Okay? Now, you're bringing together all these different perspectives and then synthesizing them into a single judgment. That's a lot of work. But that's okay with these people because they score high in need for cognition. It's a term from psychology. It's very simple. It says basically, how much do you enjoy thinking? People who score high in need for cognition, they do puzzles for pleasure. The harder the puzzle is, the more pleasurable it is. They desire to practice and improve. They want to get better. And you might say, who doesn't want to get better? But in psychology, there are two mindsets that have been identified, broadly speaking. Most people, you might say, doesn't everybody think, well, if I practice, I'll get better? Like I'll learn, I'll get better? No, in fact, there's a mindset called the fixed mindset, which is basically, it's the belief that somehow our abilities, our talents, our skills, that we're just sort of born with them. You have a certain level. And when you try and you fail, you simply reveal the level of your ability. That's it, it's done, I'm not going to try again. The growth mindset, in contrast to that, is the idea that, okay, I tried it, I failed. Well, let me figure out why I failed, then I'll try it again and try and do better. It's the growth mindset. These folks have that in spades. Intellectual humility, finally. And this is one that's fundamental. This is why I set it off a little bit. Intellectual humility is not hand-wringing and thinking you're not worthy. It's more of a worldview. You look at reality and you say, this is so bloody complex, right? It's the universe, reality is so vast, so complex, so difficult, that to even understand a little bit of it at any time is going to require a constant struggle. And human beings are flawed. We make mistakes. So even when I'm making this struggle, I will make mistakes. Why is that perspective, that worldview so important? A couple of reasons. If you have that worldview, number one, what are you going to be doing? You're constantly going to be checking your own thinking for the mistakes. And that introspection is universal among good forecasters. You'll find that introspection. The other aspect that flows from this naturally is this. If the universe is so damn complex, forget certainty. Certainty is an illusion. And if you forget certainty, what do? Drop 100% and 0% from your vocabulary. Everything is 1 to 99%. 1 to 99. It's all about increments of uncertainty. That's probabilistic thinking, and it's not natural. People don't naturally do it. Scientists do it. People trained to do it. And these super forecasters do it in spades, and they do it so much it becomes habitual. I once had a conversation with a super forecaster, and I asked, do you read? Yeah, I read lots. Well, what do you read? Not fiction, nonfiction? He said, oh yeah, we have both. I said, well, in what proportion? What do you read? He said, it's about 70-30. And then he caught himself and said, no, wait, 65-35, right? That's in a casual conversation. Humans don't do that. But this person does that because he's made it habitual. And it's absolutely essential to their success. And by the way, really fundamental aspect of intellectual humility, and this is a bit paradoxical. The people who are likely to be good forecasters are the people who, when you ask them to make a forecast, like say, tell me about the state of technology in the year 2040, they're likely to say, I don't know. I can't forecast that. What are you, crazy? They're humble about not just their own ability, but our species' ability to make forecasts. And paradoxically, that also helps make them better forecasters. Okay, but that's all very vague, right? These are characteristics, broadly speaking. What exactly do they do? How do they go and make a subjective judgment? To talk about that, I want to introduce this fellow. Anybody recognize him? Very rare, it's very seldom that people do recognize. I was kind of hoping this crowd might. Nobody? No. Physicist, thank you. That's half of it there. Okay. Well, that's something. That is Enrico Fermi, the legendary Italian-American physicist, in fact. And Fermi, in his lifetime, one of the things that Fermi was actually famous for was what are now called Fermi estimates. And what that meant was that there would be problems in physics where they couldn't measure. And Fermi would come along and he would make an estimate. Time would pass, their ability to measure would advance, and then they would do the measurement and they would discover, wow, Fermi's estimate was like spot on. How did you do that, Enrico Fermi? And Fermi started to teach people how he did estimates. And what Fermi taught people is very, very, very similar to what superforecasters do all the time. Now, so imagine you're in a classroom and Enrico Fermi is teaching you this. How does he teach his method? He asks you questions, weird questions, like how many piano tuners are there in Chicago? Questions that make you scratch your head and you're sort of going, how do I answer that? Like normal people will look at this and they will say, you'll scratch your head. You'll think vaguely, how big is Chicago? I don't know. How many people own a piano anyway? And then a number will come out. Okay? Now, what does that sound like? Right, that's the TV pundit method. Vaguely thinking about information and then somehow a number emerges somehow or other. And Fermi said to his students, don't do that. Big mistake, don't do that. He said, break down the problem in order that you can examine your thinking. And so if Fermi were to approach this question, he would do this. He would say, well, let's ask ourselves, what's the information I would need to know in order to answer the problem correctly, like calculate it exactly. I need to know the number of pianos in Chicago, how often pianos are tuned each year, how long it takes to tune a piano, how many hours per year a piano tuner tunes, works. Works. And of course, if you think about that, obviously, clearly, you could then calculate precisely how many piano tuners there are in Chicago. But of course, you might say to yourself, well, that's terrific. You've now replaced one thing I don't know with 4 things I don't know. How is this progress? And Fermi says, just wait, continue. And so he says, break down each of these points. Okay? So let's break down the first one. The number of pianos in Chicago. What would you need to know in order to calculate exactly how many pianos there are in Chicago? Well, you need to know the population of Chicago, the percentage of the population that owns a piano, and how many institutions own a piano. Then you could calculate it precisely. And again, you say, terrific, that's 3 more things I don't know. This is progress, right? And then Fermi says, no, push on. Problem, eventually, when you keep pushing on like this, you hit a wall. So for instance, the population of Chicago, you can't break it down any further. You either know it or you don't. And when you get to that wall, you have to make a guess. You try and think about it as carefully as possible, but you still have to make a guess. So that's the same with all of these points. You extend them, you try and break them down, but eventually you're going to hit a wall, then you make your guess. And then when you've made all your guesses, you pack them all up, put them all together, and there's your final estimate. And it works. It works. It's an excellent way of making an estimate. Why does it work? When you make an estimate using the TV pundit method, which is vaguely thinking about information and somehow a number emerges, there's a big jumble in your brain, a jumble of information, a jumble of beliefs, a jumble of prejudices and biases and God knows what else. And somehow something emerges from that. Fermi's method forces you to take it apart, take out one belief, put it on the table, look at it carefully. Take out another piece of information, put it on the table, look at it carefully, step by step by step by step. And when you're very careful like that, when you're very methodical like that, you have overlooked considerations, things that never would have occurred to you, they're revealed. Mistakes and biases, which are always there, they get corrected, at least somewhat. And assumptions are examined, because there are always assumptions that go unexamined. And that's what produces an accurate estimate. So, how would a super forecaster handle this Yasser Arafat question? Now, what was that question again? Do you remember what the question was? Did Israel poison Yasser Arafat? No. Will either the French or Swiss inquiries find elevated levels of polonium in the remains of Yasser Arafat's body? It's a similar question, it's a related question, but it's not the same question. I pulled a bait and switch on you, okay? Why did I pull a bait and switch on you? Because we do that to ourselves all the time. It's a basic element of human decision making. Psychologists call it attribute substitution. When you are confronted with a difficult question, you'll create a question which feels more intuitively easier to answer. You'll answer the intuitively easier to answer question, and then you will feel that you've answered the original question, but you haven't. You're just fooling yourself. We do that to ourselves all the time. So, how then does a super forecaster handle this? The real question, the actual question. Let me just put the question back up. The question is, you start by saying, how could it be yes? If you want to break it down Fermi style, how could the answer to this question be yes? In fact, there was a super forecaster, we talked about it in the book, there was a super forecaster who handled this question, and I will go through his thinking now. By the way, his name was Bill Flack. He's a retired Department of Agriculture employee. Spent most of his career putting drainage ditches in the ground. He lives in a small town in Nebraska, and he's an outstanding geopolitical forecaster. So how did he handle this question? Well, he said, how could the answer be yes? And he thought about it carefully. He realized that the very first step in his analysis had absolutely nothing to do with Israeli politics. Anybody spot it? Scientists must be able to detect polonium. If the scientists can't detect the polonium, then the answer is no, regardless of all that Israeli politics stuff. And so the very first thing Bill Flack did was he focused right in on the question, he recognized this, and then he went and researched the science of polonium testing. Only when he had satisfied himself that the answer to this is yes, they can detect it, did he then proceed to the next step, Fermi style. So, now we're going to proceed to the next step. How could you end up with polonium in Yasser Arafat's remains? Israel poisoned Yasser Arafat, right? That's the obvious one. But it's only one. It's only one route to yes. A Palestinian rival could have poisoned Yasser Arafat. Someone could have planted polonium. If you think about this, to make it look like he was poisoned, if you think about this carefully, there are other hypotheses too, other routes to yes. But I'm not going to complicate things. But you realize what's happening here. Why does this matter? Because the probability of a yes, for when you think about it in terms of there's one path, that's number one, there's two paths, number two, three paths, number three, that probability of those three things combined has to be greater than the probability of one alone. Pretty elementary logic, right? And Bill Flack recognized this. Here he is at the beginning of the question, literally at the beginning of the question, and he is already a lot closer to a correct answer than somebody who made the mistake of falling for the wrong question and zeroed in only on the one path to a yes. Because ultimately they did find polonium, by the way. They did. By the way, it was only one research team. The other research team didn't. It's a very confused mess. So don't go thinking Yasser Arafat was murdered. In fact, the consensus among experts was, we don't know. Science. Okay. So here's all this careful thinking, unpacking. I want to leave you with one quick story, very quickly. Anybody recognize this man? This one you recognize. Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense under JFK and Lyndon Johnson. Why do I want to finish off with him? Because Robert McNamara was a super forecaster. This guy was amazingly analytical. He was brilliant and careful and computer-like in his thinking. And that's why he rose up through the ranks at the Ford Motor Company. It's why he put Ford back on top. It's why he became president of Ford. It's why JFK made him Secretary of Defense. And if you know Robert McNamara's career, you know that the most consequential decision that he made was what? To escalate in Vietnam. So how did that happen? How did he screw up so badly, this brilliant man? The answer is he, like everybody else in Washington, believed in something called the domino theory. If South Vietnam falls, all the other nations in Southeast Asia will fall, American national security will be jeopardized. Therefore, it was worth the risk of getting into a quagmire. So we should escalate. Now, if this supremely analytical man is making this enormously consequential decision, and he's aware of the risks, he must have done it so rigorously. It must be so careful. It must be so tightly analyzed. I want to read that document. And guess what? You can't, because there is no such document. It doesn't exist, because they never analyzed it. They never did a serious analysis of the domino theory. It was just something that everybody took to be true. Pretty incredible, isn't it? Pretty disturbing. And when McNamara, to his enormous credit, wrote his autobiography in the mid-1990s, he said, how did we screw up? I can only say that the press of events, everything was happening so fast, we were working so fast, we were working so hard, that we never stopped to question our assumptions. Even on this enormously consequential decision, they screwed up that badly. And here's a really sad coda to the story. At one point, the director of the CIA finally said, you know what, we should analyze this domino theory. Is it true? What happens if South Vietnam falls? And he went to the CIA analyst and he said, do a proper analysis of this. And you know what the analysis concluded? It was an amazingly accurate forecast of exactly what did happen. It said, domino theory, no. There'll be some consequences, not that serious. So the CIA director walked it over to the White House, handed it to Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson put it in a drawer, didn't show it to anybody. Why? It was 1967. It was already too late. Okay, so I started with Yasser Arafat's death. I ended with the Vietnam War, so that's enough light and entertaining, all right? Thanks.